Yep, thanks, Joe. If you want to stop sharing. All
Yep,
right.
there we go. You should be able to go now.
So I'm going to share my screen. Again, so we're in Fliplet Studio, and we'll go through an example here. As Joe mentioned at the start, some of you may have joined late. Please keep yourself muted and your video turned off because we are recording this. If you have questions, just type them in chat. When I finish my demo here, we'll be able to go through those questions. Yeah, hopefully we can get through all of them. If not, Joe and I can always reach back out to people afterwards. So we're going to start with this example here. It's just a single screen, but it has some interesting items inside of it that really, without doing a lot of custom HTML and CSS previously, wasn't possible until we had this new layout system. So we've got some text alongside this image. We've got this scrollable set of images across the bottom. And as Joe mentioned, we have different designs for mobile. For tablet, you can see we've got a little bit extra space up here. This no longer scrolls because it fits in the whole width. And then also on desktop, we've got a lot more extra space. Just makes it easier to read here in the center. And as Joe was showing in some pictures, it's a little easier to see in Studio. When I hover over different elements, I can see kind of an orange border around what I'm selecting. So I'm kind of selecting the main container here. I can see the green padding area, that's just leaving extra space on the top. And then the blue is margin, which is outside of the container, keeping things constrained on web to the center of the screen. So we'll switch back to mobile view for most of this, but basically I have different screens here, and I'm going to break down how we built this screen with each of the separate components. So the first is text. You may think that that was just simple text that we just threw up, but first off, in the new system, some of you may be familiar previously in Fliplet, you could kind of just type anywhere. Now you do actually have to drag and drop this text component to a screen to be able to type inside of it. And you can see when I hover over this, we have some padding applied and we've got this orange box. To edit the settings for it, I can just click on this paintbrush icon and it will open the appearance settings for this text item. Now what we have is pretty basic. All of these are standard. It's 100% of the width. It's 15 pixels of padding on the top, left, and right. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned, it's a little different on the web and the tablet view. It's not actually taking up the full width like it is on mobile. Typically, it's just a good idea to have things no wider than 600 pixels. It's just easier for the human eye to read. So what we can do is, again, go back to the appearance settings for this item and change it specifically for tablet and desktop. So on mobile, it really looks fine. There's nothing we need to change. But if we go back to tablet, it's kind of a little too wide. And on desktop, it's really too wide. I mean, it's just one paragraph and it doesn't even fill the whole width. We can see here we have these kind of orange dots, which, as Joe mentioned, it's basically saying it's not inherited. The typical inheritance is you edit something on mobile, tablet takes those settings, and then desktop takes the tablet settings. So you really start off editing there and everything else gets applied. But when you want to make changes to the desktop only, you can go over here and we can set the width. So instead of 100%, I'm just going to do a pixel count, and it's going to make it really skinny there, but I'm going to make it 600 pixels. And that's going to achieve much more of what we want. It's much more readable. Now, if this was a paragraph on its own, I may also want a little bit more spacing on the top. But ultimately, that's going to give us here kind of what we have, that there's just extra space. Now, one of the other things we've done here in this example is actually have a container component around the text. You can see I hover over the text and I get this orange box. and I hover over here and I get another box. Now on mobile, that's really hard to see because they're kind of right on top of each other. If I click this icon here, it tells me that there's a container and it selects the container which is kind of behind this component. And then I can edit the settings specifically for the container instead of the text. And again, I can see here I've got extra padding applied on tablet for this container, and also on the web is inheriting that from the tablet. Okay, so that's just very simple how to get that text set up. Okay, so now let's take a look at how to add the image and the kind of author's name and title next to it as a component. If we go down to this demo, you can see that by default, if we just drop an image component and two text components on a screen, kind of has them top to bottom here. So we need to get the names to the side. And if I hover over these text fields, you can see that they're also taking up the full width of the screen, that orange highlight bar there. So the first thing we need to do is add a container. So we can add that to the screen. And then we have a couple of ways to kind of drag and drop components in. You can do that from here, drag them in. I find it's easiest to actually go to the screen structure here. You kind of just move this over to the side a little bit. Sometimes it takes a little finesse. There we go. And then it kind of, you can see it indents it. That means it's inside that container. Now, we've got some weird things going on here. This kind of resized. This is still dropped down below. So you need to start to think of how items are grouped together, and we want to have the text grouped together. And the way we're going to do that is just add another component and put the text in. So we'll have the kind of overall container with the image, and then another container that has the text in it. So I'll put the text inside. Oops, put it in the right order there. And then I will edit this container. And what we're going to do is make sure that it displays left to right. We'll leave that the same, but we're going to change the width. We don't want it to be 100%. We're going to actually have it be auto. And that will put it off to the side. Looks like I need to remove some padding here from this one. We don't really need that extra padding on top. And then if we go back to this component, actually, sorry, I don't want that to have left to right. I want this to have top to bottom. And that will kind of drop them right next to each other. So it was, the reason it was displaying it with an extra space is it was actually wrapping. So it couldn't, it was trying to display them left to right, but there wasn't enough room. So it actually made a whole other row, which kind of added extra space. Now it's putting them right on top of each other. Again, because of the setting here that says flow direction. So, you know, we could reverse that and put it at the bottom of this container. That would look kind of weird, but so we're going to have it float at the top there. And now this kind of looks like what we have in our main example here. As some images and doing things with a full screen. Now, what I have here is a container. You can see that the background is just set to a gray just to make it kind of stand out, and just a single image inside of it. Joe mentioned some of the positioning. So I just showed you the direction of things, setting them up, you know, left to right, top to bottom. That's what we call flow direction. We can also figure out where we want to position this on the screen. Now, the first thing I've done with the container is set the width to 100% and the height to auto. And that's going to fill the whole screen here. There are some other options you can use, such as doing vertical height, again, or percent. If you're not familiar with CSS, you may not be familiar with these terms, that's fine. You can always come in and just edit it and play around with it. Ultimately, that's going to look the same. But if we have things like a menu bar on this screen, it may change things in a way that you don't expect. So I'm just going to leave that on auto. And the way that it understands that this container should be the full kind of width and height is I'm setting it relative to its container. Now, if you look at the screen structure, there's no container above this container. The container for kind of the last element is the actual screen itself. So it's setting it relative to that screen size when I say relative to container. And again, I just wanted to kind of show you live moving this image around. So we have it right now centered vertically and horizontally. I can just tap this, it moves it to the top. There's some margin around this image, which I can see in the blue there, which is why it's not totally at the top. Move it to the bottom. Kind of stretch the image, which the image itself won't stretch, but the component kind of does fill the whole height there. And then put it back to center. We can move it to the left, to the right. If there's multiple items, we can put some space in between that. I won't show that yet until we get to the next screen where we do have multiple items. So if we have several images here, you can see I've set this up. It's exactly the same as the last demo in terms of the settings. We just have 5 images. So it's set to center vertically and horizontally. But you may ask why. I mean, it's not centered vertically. There's a big space here. Why is it doing that? And the reason has to do with the wrapping. So as Joe mentioned, this is automatically wrapping this, could go off the screen because it's five images, but it's basically setting up a second row, and it's centering those 2 rows, not the images kind of as a whole, putting them in the center. If we look at tablet, we can see that this is actually, it is centered because the tablet and the desktop view are wide enough to accommodate 5 images, whereas on mobile, it's trying to wrap that into a second row. Now, in our example, we have a scrollable section on mobile that it doesn't fit, but we don't want to have a second row. We want people to scroll or on a mobile device, probably swipe to be able to see more items. So to center things first off, we would add another container. I'm going to kind of add that at the top. Oops. Okay. And this container, oops, actually I need to add this container inside of it. Again, I'm just dragging it inside. And it's not setting the full height there. Okay. And then what we're going to do is center that, center that. And it does sometimes take a second for changes to apply, but they do kind of change in real time if anyone's unfamiliar with the appearance settings. So ultimately what we're going to have is a centered item like this where again, this container is set to center everything, but the container above it is also set to center everything. And what that means is, even though these images are wrapping and creating a second row, this external container is centering the whole internal container here so that it makes sure that it's in the center regardless of how many kind of rows we have of images. Now, the way to make it scrollable is a little different as well. if anyone again is familiar with CSS, you can see we do have settings here that just says overflow. Overflow X is the horizontal, overflow Y is the vertical. And you may think instead of setting it visible, we can set it to scroll, but it's not going to really do anything because again, it's automatically wrapping. It's making that second row. Now, wrap content on, again, you'd think we could just turn that off, but it's squashing all of these elements. It's still trying to fit it into 100% of the width. So this scroll isn't really being used by the component there. Again, you guys may be sensing a theme here. We need another container. So if I drop a container in and I drop everything inside of that, oops, inside of that, there we go. What I'm going to do with the first container is the width is going to stay 100%. We are going to turn wrap off. This is probably going to do some weird things, so don't worry about it just yet. And we are going to set the overflow X to scroll, which means if it goes beyond the X direction, the horizontal direction, it will automatically create a scrolling section. Now if we go to the second container and edit the settings here, we're going to set the width instead of 100% to just be auto. And again, we're going to leave wrap off, but we're going to set the overflow to be visible. So it is allowing it to overflow in this first container, which is why it, kind of goes all the way here, and it kind of ignores the width constraints. But this container is saying if something inside of me goes too wide, then create a scroll section across the X direction. Okay, and that's what we see here. Same thing, that's what we have in our example at the bottom. Now again, because on tablet and desktop, it's wide enough that it doesn't need to scroll. It's automatically, just as wide as the images are. It's only on mobile when it kind of automatically adds that in. Now, one of the last things I want to show is a little more complex, but it's something I know a lot of people have asked about, and that's kind of how we deal with images. A full screen image, a banner image, kind of like what we have here. You can see that it's going to resize on all these different sizes. I would probably add some margins and other things to it, but you might think that you just drop an image component in and then you go and edit those images settings. But let's see what happens when we do that. So let's set the height of this to be just 100 pixels. Okay, so it set it to 100 pixels, but it set the width to auto. So it automatically kept the proportions of the picture, but made it only 100 pixels high. So you might think, okay, if we just force the width to 100%, that should stretch it. And it does, but it doesn't. It keeps the image itself the same size, but the component is stretched to be 100%. You can see, again, this orange outline. So how do we get the image to actually stretch or fit to a specific size? And again, we use a container component. So with the container component, and I'll actually edit the one I already have, the first setting you have is being able to set a background. In my previous example, I had just a color of gray so you guys could see it. In this, I'm using an image. So I choose image, I click on this and I select the image from my file system. And then you can kind of choose, again, based on the settings I have for its height, I can choose what part of the image I see. So I can look at the bottom, look at the top, center it. So it is kind of cropping the image to fit the container size, but I can move it around to the different spots I want to see. So again, the way to make this banner is I have the width set to 100% and the minimum height set to 100 pixels. So this is putting it at 100 pixels, but 100% width, and it's expanding the image to fill that container. I could keep it the original size and it would just, the image is way too big, it just shows me a tiny part of it. Or I can keep it contained, which will let me see the whole image, but again restrict it to the size of the container. If I wanted to repeat it to make sure there was no white space, I could repeat horizontally and you'll see it's just the same image over and over again. But we'll put that back to expand. So again, you know, I may want, as Joe said, maybe I want this image on mobile. I'll set this back to the full height. Maybe I want this image on mobile and this one on web and tablet. I can go and turn this off. Now, if I turn off an image like this, it's, you know, it's gone. How do I select it? Again, the easiest way, the nice thing is this screen structure. You can see everything that's in your screen. And I can go back to this container. And even though it's not visible on mobile, I can make it visible on tablet and then on web, and it'll pop back up. Okay. So again, going back to our example here, we have just simple text. It's got a little bit of padding on the sides. We've got this container component, which has an image and another container inside of it. That container has two text components, so we can have them aligned vertically while still being next to this image. We've got a text component that has some padding on it, but also is limited to being 600 pixels wide, again, just to make it more readable on larger sizes. We've got an image component. This one's just a basic image component. We don't have it set as a banner or anything. There is some margin to give extra space in between it and the other components. And again, on desktop, we have a wider component that has margin, so it doesn't make the image, you know, huge. And then we've got this section on the bottom of additional images that on mobile is scrollable, but on tablet and web is just going to fit the full width. Okay. So that was just one example. There's a lot of things you can do with this. As I mentioned, using containers in a lot of places, you kind of need to change your mindset and think about, how do I want to group items together, make a container around that, and then you'll be able to have a lot more control over how things are displayed. You know, having images in a row or having them spaced out. One of the other things I didn't show that I wanted to show really quickly on tablet is, again, just the spacing on these, that I can put space between items so that it fills the full width instead of centering them. Space around the items so it kind of keeps equal space between each item and the edge of the screen. But the screen structure and the combination of the appearance settings, which some of you may not be familiar with entirely. The appearance settings launched back in probably October. A lot of this allows you to accomplish things that normally you just do with custom code with CSS or HTML. Now makes it really easy for you to change on the fly and change again for different display sizes. And each individual component can have its own appearance settings. All right. So that is it for me. Joe, did you have anything else you wanted to add, or did we want to look at taking questions?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brett. I'm just going to jump back really quickly to the presentation, mainly just to kind of run through a summary so that everybody's kind of on the same page of what we've gone through, and then we'll be able to jump into the question section. So just to kind of finish off with a bit of a summary, what we've just looked at today is this new responsive block model, which is how we're now going to be building the screens and layouts in the Fliplet Studio. What it really does, it gives you more control over the mobile, tablet, and web design for all of your apps. And the main thing that you're really going to be using when you're kind of setting this up is using this new container component that Brett has really now showed you how it works. It's really important to kind of use that in combination with the appearance settings, which is how you can set all of the percentage and the appearance and make sure that the app looks the way you want it to look. Now, before we just jump into questions, again, just want to mention for those of you that have existing apps with us, feel free to reach out to me and Brett if you want to get your app onto the new system, and we're more than happy to help you do that. And that's all that we wanted to cover with you guys today. Thank you so much for being here. We have a couple of questions that we're going to run through, but feel free to, if you still have any questions, submit them using the chat. And I think, Brett, one of the things I was thinking about when you were doing your presentation, which might be good just to cover, is maybe showing the new screen layouts that we've done as part of this new update.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to stop sharing so I can take back over real quick?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me know if you can do that now.
Yep, looks like it. Okay, so everyone should be able to see me again. So yeah, as Joe mentioned, if you make a new app from it, our available templates, it's going to have these new settings applied to it. And if you add a new screen, you'll be able to see we have a bunch of new layouts. So previously we had onboarding, we have a couple different styles. We have a login, a full screen that's kind of set up with a sign up button, and it kind of displays differently instead of just dropping the component into a blank screen. We have a sign up, just a basic form with email and password. It's a form component. You can go in and edit it. I won't go through all of these, but there's a lot of different examples. Again, this example we just went through is this one here called article serif. These are going to change. We're going to add a lot more because it's a really powerful way to have the same components that we've always had, images and text, display in really dynamic ways. We have some really new things that we've not really seen before, like having a Google map. Some menu screens, a lot of you have used that. And of course, you can always just use a blank screen if you want to design it all yourself, but we really recommend taking a look at some of these examples that we have. Were there any other questions, Joe?
Yeah, great. We've gotten a couple of questions on the chat. So let me just read out the first one. So there's a question asking, can custom containers be set to repeat or automatically created in conjunction with data sources through CSS, or is this virtually only functional in blog style screens for now? So I think what this is really asking, if we can kind of join up a data source and then automatically create different screen layouts from there. And I think the containers isn't really the way to do that, because containers, what it really allows you to do is control where on the screen your components or your content should go. So the way that we can actually automatically kind of dragging content from the data sources is obviously using things like the list from data sources, but we also have a couple of other more custom features, which we kind of call data-driven screens, which we can use to automatically kind of pull in information from the data sources and print them out on the screen. Now, that's quite different. It's kind of a different big topic in itself. So that's possible, but that's not really what the containers are here to do, because the containers is here really just to help you lay out the information that you already have.
Right. As Joe said, I would probably use a list from data source component if I wanted to connect to a data source. And that could be put inside a container that can control how it displays. But the list from data source is a very, very powerful component that lets you choose different items and how they're displayed from a data source. Outside of that, you're probably still going to be looking at some custom code.
Exactly. And we have another question as well, and that is, can you structure fields in a form using containers? Now, I think at the moment, and Brett, do correct me if I'm wrong, I think at the moment the containers allows you to structure components in general, but it doesn't actually let you kind of structure things within other components. So you can obviously put your form within one of the components, and that kind of lets you kind of play around with different settings, but it doesn't kind of work within the form itself. So you can't have within your form yet a container that kind of lets you organize your form fields.
Right. You're going to want to set it as probably one form, but yeah, you're not going to be able to move each individual item. Technically speaking, you could make a container and make separate forms within that container and do that, but it would just be kind of difficult in terms of gathering data and submitting it to a data source or emailing it out. Having multiple different forms, ultimately, again, that may be something that you set up with a little custom code. You can look at the CSS and customize the CSS to add more spacing or change the width of specific elements.
Yeah, great. I think that was all the questions that we've had for now. And so thanks everyone for joining us for today's webinar. I've hoped you find it useful. As I mentioned in the beginning of this session, as we have been recording, what we'll do is we'll follow up with all of you in a couple of days to share with you this video. You can use it as a refresher whenever you want to. We'll also share with you this presentation that we've gone through, so you can also use that as kind of taking a look if you wanted to get any kind of refresher. But that's it from us today. So thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully you have a good rest of your day.